Okay, so this is part 3 of Monochromatic Machine, the details. As you can see here, everything's roughed in, which is where we left off. Basic shapes, primary shapes are there, a little bit of secondary work. Now I'm getting out my white, my blue, and my quinacridone. And this is where I start mixing some of the same colors I mixed earlier. You can see that I'm mixing the dark and then adding white so that I can see the color, which of course, as we discussed previously, is difficult when the color's in its dark form. So I just kind of lean it back and forth a little bit here and a little bit there until I'm somewhat satisfied with the color. Now in this phase, we are trying to go more for color correctness, I guess, or hue fidelity. But even now, we still have plenty of time and space to work on getting the precise colors worked out. So you can see here I'm creating a scale of color, some lights, some darks, and I'm brushing in darks and then lights into darks, finding colors in between that help me to transition. I'm squinting a lot. I'm looking at the shapes and the gradations of tone, putting in some contour lines. And you'll notice I'm not doing a whole lot of finicky blending, though I am doing some blending. Getting an even lighter value. Really, you're just testing it out. Sometimes when you first put down these colors, they look chalky. But that will clarify itself and you'll be able to gain more intensity as the process moves forward. So really just satisfy yourself that you're in the right pond as far as hue is concerned. And your primary goal is to vary the colors. I'm using my flat brush and I'm really using just the tip. So you're not scrubbing, you're blending. So if you touch your, say the back of your wrist and I know this sounds weird, kind of caress it, that's about the pressure that you're going to be using. You're not rubbing it like you were rubbing off ink or glue that you had gotten on your hand. It's not about scrubbing, it's about caressing the paint. I think I'm probably spending a little bit too much time on the fabric, so pretty soon I think I need to move on. Again, I want you to notice that the edges are unimportant. I went right over that pipe. It's a lot easier to make those transitions appear behind if you go ahead and break the edge and then come back and reassert the pipe on top. Adding shapes that weren't there or that are incorrect in their scale or shape. Now I'm putting down some sienna and you can see I'm moving in a line towards my blue. And that's where I'm going to get my blacks and my grays. So you can see as soon as I start to add those darker tones, I get more space. Adding white. And again, I just think about it like I'm laying in a tone. I'm not getting all fussy and fancy with it. So, it's like the block-in phase, but smaller marks. And more attention to, say, the thickness of the pipe, which we discussed earlier was a little bit thin. You run out of paint sometimes, so you mix it again. But as I've said in previous projects, you've got the previous mixtures there to match. And again, it's not a matter of getting the perfect color. It's more about value. What I really notice about that pipe that's going to happen eventually is it's going to have to be a little bit warmer. Right now it's very cool gray. So eventually I'm going to want to introduce a little bit more burnt sienna into my gray mixture as opposed to blue where it is now, and that's going to help to warm up that pipe. Not to mention that the predominance of intense blue is going to create simultaneous contrast. You should remember that from your color theory, and that is that neutral colors are much more easily influenced in their hue or their apparent hue when they're seen next to more intense colors. So a gray next to a blue is going to appear kind of orangey, a gray next to a green is going to appear more reddish, or vice versa. Again, notice I'm working the whole, not concentrating on any one area or shape. You can see that I have those streaks of reflected light on the side of that bracket, that bookshelf bracket. So I just paint them in. I don't worry about blending. And again, you'll notice kind of just flicking in. You don't want to be too shy about being kind of improvisational in the way you lay down your strokes. If you look at painters like John Singer Sargent or Titian, there's a real virtuosity to the way that they use their brushwork. Obviously that shape is wrong that I was just working on. I'll take care of it later. Right now I'm playing around with highlights. They may or may not stay. But sometimes I just can't help myself. And I think it does look pretty reflective. So again, on top of the smaller shapes, I make even smaller shapes. So I work from secondary to tertiary shapes. Primary shapes is the rough end, secondary shapes, and then those tertiary details like reflection. I felt like maybe that violet wasn't red enough, so I'm adding more quinacridone to my mixture. And again, it's really not that important that you mix the same tone every time. You can change it, but you can also add other colors and get a variation that you didn't expect. And that can create a lot more visual interest if you have both warm and cool colors within that violety blue as opposed to just one color. Using smaller brushes for details. Remember, when you get into details, switch your brushes. I think you also notice that I'm constantly cleaning. Cleaning brushes is very important. Now I've mixed up some more dark. Leans a little bluer now, but that's okay. That phthalo blue is super dark. Just little touches of that violet to heighten the sense of light in the fabric. So, I kind of worked the whole and then I returned to the fabric. This dark blue down here needs some darker darks in it as well. More sienna to get my blacks. And again, just laying it in, not blending. I know it's kind of hard to see in my reference photo, but it's very important that those darks be dark. We've discovered that in our last two paintings. If you don't have the darks, the lights aren't going to look light enough. Mixing up some more gray blues for the highlights in that fabric. And if you go too light, that's fine. I feel like I want to heighten the lights in that just for editorial reasons. It feels kind of dark and murky in the photograph. Maybe even a little bit lighter. Yeah. Maybe too light. But you can always go back. That's the beauty of direct opaque painting. It is layer after layer after layer. Smaller brushes for smaller details. I want you to pay attention to my palette. And you can see that towards the bottom left there's a lot of grays. Towards the bottom middle there's a lot of blues. And towards the top of the kind of pyramidal shape and to the right there's a lot of violet colors. And there's light, dark, and middle versions of them all. Here you can see I'm heightening that light. But I'm not just filling it in. I'm adding it in and then I'm kind of blending it into the surrounding color. So you can really see the brush strokes with these tertiary details. Correcting that shape. Something was wrong with that negative space, so I'm dealing with it. And at the same time, I'm dealing with the flashlight base. It's also time to start looking at some of these reflections that we're seeing. So I see that gray being reflected into the silver surface. And I'm adding some marks within the marks, some tertiary marks within the secondary marks. You can see how the more marks I make, the more reflective it becomes. Back to my dark black. So within some of the dark areas, I'm reinforcing them by adding a kind of more bluish dark. So that mixture that I've made has a little more blue in it than it does sienna. So it's not as neutral. More gray. Now here it looks a little brown to me, so I'm adding some sienna to get that brown. And then I take some of that same sienna and I start to introduce it into my pipe. Because you don't want to just have that sienna in one area. And as we've discussed earlier, that pipe has a warmer hue. Now I'm brightening and heightening that fabric to the left-hand side. I've really neglected it for far too long. Again, notice how I'm working the hole. I didn't finish the fabric. I just added some more light towards the bottom because it's lighter towards the bottom. But there's also some light in this bracket, so I'm adding some light into the bracket. And you can see how that green I introduced previously gives it a little bit more of a turquoise quality. Shadow needs to be deepened up against that light edge. Here I noticed that I had a proportional error. So I'm trying to correct that. This also looks a little orangey, so I added a little bit of sienna to my white. Probably need more, actually. Back to the pipe. thickening up that bottom area. I decided that my ball, I wanted it to be closer to the pipe. So I'm going to increase the scale and change the shape a little bit. Very cattywampus right now, but I'll fix it later. I'm also going to have to repaint that negative gray space, which you'll see me do in a minute. And that'll help with the shape of the bracket. Kind of wish I left the ball alone, but I can correct it later. Now I'm going to come back to my cloth. A little too pink, so I gray it down. A little too gray, not dark enough. You can see that upper part's really dark. So I try with some of my burnt sienna blue mixture to get a gray. And then I make a light, which you can see in the upper left hand corner, and I blend it into the wet paint. And that starts to give it a little bit more form. The bottom obviously needs to be light. I'm using a very thin brush, and I'm kind of trying to evoke that grid pattern that you see. Putting in my strokes as if I'm following the contour, so they're not just flat, they actually round out like you see in the pattern itself. So that's about where we need to be for next class. There's still a lot of work to be done in part 4, but that will be what I will call the finishing touches. So adjusting color, dealing with things like textures, reflections, all of the finer stuff.